Seems that every tendril of the establishment is coming for Nigel Farage at once, and it's all coincided with the Clacton by-election and the murder of Anne Widdecombe. And yes, before we get into it, I have had a shave, you will get over it. Anyways, Farage's polling has plummeted to its lowest level, the Daily Mail regrettably reports. It has found that Farage is now down to 24% in an opinion poll, which is its weakest result for over 18 months, and we've seen a consistent decline since their peak of above 30% around the middle of May last year. And there are people questioning that decline within Reform. Not questioning the polling figures and whether or not they're inaccurate. We remember Nigel Farage's war with YouGov last year when he said the methodology was creating outliers for Reform and saying they were ranked much lower than all of the others, other than Lord Ashcroft, who wants to gloss the Tories at every available opportunity. But now it seems that all the polls have consistently caught up, and Reform are down to 21, 22 points in consistent polls. And it seems like a series of misfortunes are befalling Nigel Farage, but also it seems like a series of self-inflicted wounds that Reform now admit have impacted their polling. The rise of Restore Britain, the induction of Conservative defectors, some which have been better received than others, and this latest Westminster bubble-centric controversy about Nigel Farage's donations from Christopher Harborne, from Posh George Cottrell, also his gold bullion sponsorship, which I put an ad in the last video, and you would be astounded the number of people that didn't get the joke. But first, this video is sponsored by Gold Bullion Partners. Use my affiliate link down in the description if you want to book your free consultation to invest in gold or silver. Gold Bullion Partners investments are exempt from CGT and VAT tax and are eligible for self-investment pension plan. They offer secure, allocated and segregated storage in London and Zurich, including for my American viewers, and for my viewers, they give you preferential storage if you use the affiliate link down in the description. Nice touch. Gold Bullion offers wholesale access to both supply and pricing, and they offer all customers a buyback guarantee. And for those of you who want all of my content ad-free going forwards, subscribe to my Substack for as little as £5 per month. That's also linked down in the description below. What can I say? I've got twins on the way and more mouths to feed. Anyway, all of this has prompted Farage to call a by-election in Clacton. And he said that he was well within his rights to make plenty of money from second jobs, sponsorships, and personal donations, and that it was necessary because of the unprecedented security threats that he faces. He was irate about the fact that the Times newspaper and Sky News broadcast his daughter's house. Sky News denied that they'd actually visited the house when they ambushed him as he got off a red-eye flight from Washington, D.C., and they then tried to retract live on air without issuing an apology. And then, only a few days later, Anne Widdecombe is killed. A couple of days after her house was broadcast on a rerun of sort of like Celebrity Homes show. And it looks like the guy travelled from Rochdale all the way down to Devon. He was a keen reader of communist literature, if the Counter-Terror Police's reports are to be believed. And he killed her with a stick. Elderly pensioner living alone. And so it's understandable that Farage needs £1 million round-the-clock security from ex-army guys, because he has had many threats to his life. We saw how he got assaulted by milkshakes and concrete on the campaign trail, and it's been even worse than that, things that we haven't heard about. So that is a persuasive pitch, and it's also persuasive to say that regardless of the outcome of the parliamentary investigation as to whether or not he should have reported those personal donations, the in-kind contributions that George Cottrell may or may not have made to Farage with housing and security and office supplies and social media team salaries for Reform, regardless of whether or not he should have reported that, regardless of whether or not his legal advice saying that he didn't was wrong, it is persuasive to say that the procedure is the punishment because the establishment would like to get rid of him. And it was for a while looking like this by-election had become something like Wile E. Coyote launching the rocket at Roadrunner without realising that his foot was already tied to it. It looked like it would backfire and blow up in his face, because all of the major parties stood down. First it was Restore Britain, who suggested they might stand a candidate against Farage, and then I think internally some members of the party realised that this would fulfil all of the accusations like papers like the Daily Mail would make about them just being a vengeance project, fuelled by vindictiveness and Rupert Lowe and staff's personal hatred towards Nigel Farage. And so they said, well, we'll stand in another one if it's called by Parliament, if Farage is suspended at the conclusion of the Parliamentary Standards investigation, but we won't stand in this one because it's Nigel Farage's personal circus down in Clacton. Now, I don't think that was a particularly persuasive message, because anyone could have foreseen that this would shape up to be Farage versus the establishment if you weren't engaged in motivated reasoning because you stood something to gain from Farage being defeated. And he won't be, by the way, he will win this by-election. But then the dominoes started to fall. The Conservatives stood down. Kemi Badenoch said, this is just Farage having a hissy fit. Clearly the talking points went out in a Conservative group chat and said, you've all got to call it a temper tantrum and not engage. Andy Burnham stood Labour down. And we know that it's Burnham because he's about to be Prime Minister in a week. He's about to win by default. And then the Liberal Democrats, and even the Greens, who once accused Farage of being a grifter and said they will stand against him, they then stood down too. So it did look like this could blow up in Farage's face. And the only candidate willing to stand against him was Count Binface. Now, Count Binface is an Oxford-educated comedian, and I use comedian in self-identification sense because he's about as funny as cancer, who has written for a series of state-approved satire shows for the BBC, and now walks around, who knows who bankrolls this, making a mockery of British elections at a time where the country is bankrupt and getting raped to death by immigrants, and stands on the stage alongside actual candidates, rather than to act as a kind of Brewster's Millions candidate, to say none of the above, and be a revolt against the Uniparty. Instead, it's more like the sardonic eyebrow raise that you would see on The Daily Show, or on John Oliver, or Mock the Week, or Have I Got News for You, if anybody actually bothered to watch those programmes, they're failing for a reason. Where it's the ability for midwits, comfortable, middle-class progressives, to reach for and dismiss all of your arguments out of hand with like a sardonic eyebrow raise and aren't you so lowbrow for reading the Daily Mail? It's the sort of thing that would be satirised on a Harry and Paul sketch. They want nothing more than for Farage to be defeated by Binface, because this will be a boon to them. Because any time in future you try to raise the prospect of remigration, or say that demographic change has done untold damage to our country, or that the government is mismanaging the economy, that there is a silent majority, silenced by the state majority of people in this country, who don't feel represented by the two flavours of decline that are presented often in Westminster, well, they'll just respond to, haha, you lost to a bin though. It's like, really, do we want to give them this win? Do you actually want your opponents to silence every conversation about the destruction of this country with this farce? Because I don't. And now people are saying that this will look bad on Farage because he has to take this by-election seriously. I know Carl and Dan did a political chat for their series last week saying there's no scenario in which Farage comes out better from this. And I just disagree with them. Because the scenario was that, like Sideshow Bob, the establishment walked straight onto the rake of making Count Binface their man. Christian Calgie did an interview with Farage in the Mail, and Farage insists that the Clacton by-election that he called, that they all stood down in, and that he is now basically only fighting against Count Binface and a couple of other independent or marginal party candidates, is still a real election. So, speaking to the Daily Mail from one of his favourite pubs in Clacton, he batted away accusations that he himself faces the prospect of becoming a laughingstock over the Commons contest. Asked if he's braced for hustings against Count Binface over the coming weeks, he branded the notion silly, saying, "I'm asking for an endorsement of me as a person and our agenda for change." It came as the bookies trimmed Binface's odds from 50-1 to 5-1 overnight, and Labour and the Tories weighed in behind the comedian, whose real name is John Harvey. The candidate, who describes himself as a 5,900-year-old space warrior and has policy pledges including building one affordable house and nationalising Adele, has branded the showdown Binface be Binfire, adding, "Bring it on." And for all of one day, people were pretending that this was funny. Or perhaps they even found it properly funny. But people are going to get Binface fatigue real quick. And this would play in Farage's favour. And when asked if Farage considered the possibility of fighting Binface as the only proper candidate, he said, no, of course not, because he wouldn't have gone for the by-election if he had. He said, why would they not contest? It's a real election, because, per protocol, He stood down, he triggered a by-election, he's now running in the election, and the calculation behind the ploy was, if I get a renewed public mandate, then Parliament will be afraid of a legitimacy crisis should they, at the end of their investigation, inevitably find Farage guilty of some misconduct rule that they found in the Justinian library of malign legislation, and if they try to eject him again or call a second by-election, well, there'll be public outrage. And it'll be a bit like after Boris Johnson prorogued Parliament and then won a 2019 election mandate to get Brexit done, if they then tried to call for a second referendum, if they tried to rejoin the European Union. It's why it's still a thorny issue to this day. So Farage made the same calculation, and it was a smart calculation, presuming that the establishment, all of the opposition parties, would run against him, because then it would look like one man versus all of the rest. And when they all stood down, there was the risk that this could look farcical. But, as Farage has now reframed it, he's accused all the other parties of working together to undermine his by-election framing of a battle between him and the establishment. The fact that both Labour and Conservatives don't want to stand, they're both showing contempt for the electorate. They can use whatever terms they want, it's a real election with real people. And all of the opposition parties can turn around and say, like Kemi Badenoch, if it's the people versus the establishment, I think Nigel Farage might be looking like the establishment and Count Binface might be the people, this whole thing's a farce. They can say this, but that means they're owning Binface. He becomes the avatar of their attempt to rid themselves of the scourge of Nigel Farage forever. And I know that there will be people that have made it this far into the video that go, but Conor, Farage is too soft. I know. I've made these criticisms consistently. The Winston Marshall and Stephen Edgington interviews in 2024 were a disaster. Taking in Nadim Zahawi and Nadine Dorries. Disaster. Playing Robert Jenrick out of position. I mean, he should just be Reform's shadow justice spokesperson. It's clearly what he likes doing. And he still hasn't addressed the fact that, while Immigration Minister, the rubber stamping of approval for visas for Sudanese, Eritrean and Afghan nationals to come into our country, and then the likes of Dawood Safi, who stabbed Wayne Broadhurst to death in broad daylight as he was walking his dog, because he got involved in an altercation between Daffy and his landlord and the landlord's teenage son, and Wayne Broadhurst was the only British man. And now Daffy is allowed to plead manslaughter because he comes from a country that has world historic rates of cousin marriage, opioid addiction, and lead poisoning. And then it turns out that the court have found him to be psychotic, mentally ill, and so he can plead diminished responsibility. Despite lying about why he was in the country in the first place, despite lying about his age, saying he was 5 years younger than he actually was, despite saying that his dad was killed by the Taliban when that wasn't true. That's all a stain on Jenrick's record, and therefore it's a stain on Reform until those issues are resolved, if they can be. And I think Reform, as we'll get onto much later, are listening to substantive criticisms. And so I'm going to offer some, in case they'll take it up. But all of our criticisms are beside the point. Because just as very few people were following the story about Farage's finances, 70 people, according to YouGov, hadn't even heard of it or weren't following it closely. So it was a very Westminster-focused, online politics-focused issue. Lots of people still see Farage as their only hope against the establishment. Their only ability to secure the mass deportations of illegals, to put a pause, at the very least, on legal migration, to ensure net negative migration, which is now the position of both Robert Jenrick and Zia Youssef, and they haven't been kicked out of the party yet for saying it, so we can only assume it's now official Reform Party policy. And they don't really get into the personality conflicts, the struggle for succession that is still going on in Reform. People don't get into that. When you're dealing with politics at the level of your average member of the public, who might well be a Farage supporter, but might still listen to LBC for their involvement in politics, this doesn't affect them. Instead, all they'll see is Farage versus Count Binface, and Count Binface being bankrolled by Labour megadonor Dale Vince, who is a massive ally of Ed Miliband and is responsible for the fact that, while he is getting very rich from renewable subsidies contracts, our electricity costs are the highest in the developed world. Or Rachel Reeves, the sitting Chancellor, who has impoverished the country, and rather than take fair criticism, but the fact that she has grown the £22 billion black hole into a £134 billion deficit, she complains about mansplaining instead. She posts online, "I will accept Nigel Farage's request to be appointed steward and bailiff of the manor of Norstead his resignation to trigger the Clacton by-election. It is a farce and a desperate distraction, and the people of Clacton deserve better, but if he wants to spend the summer arguing with a bin, I won't stop him. So you seem gleeful about the fact that the voters in Clacton aren't being offered a real alternative if you're saying that Farage is a charlatan. So the establishment are putting up, by default, Farage, who they say is a grifter, who is dangerous, who is a charlatan, and Count Binface. The same Count Binface, the MPs are currently trying to change rules to allow to wear his costume in the Commons. The same Count Binface, the Liberal Democrat MPs are sitting on the green benches saying, hey, you giant fucking clown, you can sit right next to us when you come in. I mean, he would be right at home among the Lib Dems. The same Count Binface, who the presumptive Prime Minister is making jokes about shaking hands with at the Makerfield count, on the timeline, meaning the sitting Labour government is endorsing Count Binface. Now, just to say, I'm almost going to quote Rachel Maddow here, no, you've not died and gone to hell, this is not a very, very bad dream, this is us, this is our country, this is our life now. Nevertheless, Farage has actually pulled this off. And it's because the establishment owns Binface. And even Binface was incredulous about this. Why is this a sentence that's coming from my mouth? When he appeared on BBC Newsnight, essentially saying, I don't know why anyone pays the licence fee, because Newsnight, a very serious political programme, has basically become a glorified podcast that nobody really watches. And there was an Andrew Marr interview on LBC where they said, well, who funds you? And he just was allowed to give these farcical, painfully unfunny answers. Honestly, I've had more humorous stubbed toes. The entire election is a joke only because they are interviewing him as if his joke policies have equal weight to not just reforms policies, but to apparently the circumvention of parliamentary procedure that they're accusing Farage of. If this truly were a really serious breach of parliamentary procedure, with his donations, if Farage really was trying to get out of a legitimate investigation, then shouldn't you be able to run against him with a credible candidate, campaign on that and win? Bit strange that you're not going to do that. Instead, you're allowing this farce to play out, so you own the farce. And I think the reason they're doing this as well is because they know they've not got actually any chance of beating Farage in Clacton. Clacton, if you remember, was the only place to have elected a UKIP MP, Douglas Carswell, when he resigned the Conservative whip, crossed over to UKIP, triggered a by-election and got re-elected. It was also the constituency that polled most in favour of reform at the 2024 general election. It's why Farage ran there in the first place. Clacton is a consistently very right-wing area. Very patriotic. Wonderful common sense people in Clacton. And it's because it's the area where lots of Cockneys got ethnically cleansed from East London via the diversity that was moved in following the Second World War. And I know this because this is actually my family as well. My family are all from East London. My granddad grew up in Poplar. He was basically born in Poplar and Limehouse. He was delivered by the nuns that have now been serialised in Call the Midwife. His house and all of the bomb sites he used to play among in the 40s and 50s is where the Olympic Stadium now is. And lots of East Londoners moved out to Bexley, Eltham, that sort of area, when they built a series of new homes and estates in the 70s, 80s. And now they've settled around here, much like many Cockneys went to Essex and seaside towns like Clacton, or places like Basildon and Billericay. And so I do know these people. As well, you probably wouldn't detect it because I have a bit of received pronunciation because I did a lot of silent reading as a kid. I blame all the JRPGs that I played and had to sort of read it, overemphasize in my mind. But I went on a lot of caravan holidays as a child because we didn't have a lot of money. And so I went to places like Great Yarmouth, which is Rupert's constituency. I went to Coombe Haven in Hastings quite frequently. I spent a lot of time on the Isle of Wight as well. In the holiday part bits, not the nice posh B&Bs. The people that are there are not expressly political. Like, they don't pay attention to terminally Westminster bubble stories like the amount of donations that Nigel Farage is receiving. But what they do pay attention to is the feeling of dispossession of their country by large waves of immigration, the feeling of regional poverty in these left-behind seaside towns. And they also channel their political sentiments into these avatar figures like Farage, or, if we want to use an allegory, of Donald Trump in the Rust Belt. Right? There were lots of left-behind Americans in flyover country that thought that Trump was their man, and that's why he won his seismic mandate in 2024. Whether or not he's used that prudently is up for debate. Nevertheless, it is inarguable that Donald Trump was an avatar of white Americans who have been left behind concerns. And the same is happening in areas of the North, which are flirting with Burnham at the moment, but I'm pretty sure the love affair will lose its sheen pretty quickly when he makes contact with government, and all over Essex and in left behind seaside towns. And so, when you insult them by saying, we don't even consider you to be worthy of a legitimate election, here's a bin to vote for instead, you're treating them with scorn and derision, and they're already a core constituency for Farage because he won a seismic majority at the last election when Reform weren't topping national polls. He won something like over 8,000 votes, more than his closest opponent. And so this time around, yeah, Farage is going to win. And I think they know it. And I will be really glad to see this kind of politics killed off. The New Statesman wrote a piece saying, we are all Count Binface. But the most annoying one I saw was actually published this morning from Sophie Jenkinson in The Guardian. Because The Guardian almost exists to piss me off personally. I believe this. I am the main character of reality. Farage had it for a day there, but then he's been deranged. Count Binface represents the silly sausage Britain I know and love. Our country is facing demographic, fiscal, cultural obsolescence. We have horrors in the headlines every single day. And you think it's a great idea to summarise our national culture as a place that doesn't take itself too seriously, that's underpinned by self-deprecation, that highlights our kindness towards one another and our fairness. It's the Britain of comedians like Victoria Wood and Bob Mortimer, Ramesh Ranganathan, Daisy May Cooper. It's the adverts for Yorkshire Tea, Tango and Iron Brew. It's the Liz Truss lettuce. Honestly, that joke is more stale than the lettuce at this point. It's basically the Britain of led by donkeys. Safe, state-endorsed satire. Like Count fucking Binface. What they want is for Mr. Blobby to stand alongside Nigel Farage at the count, and then when they gerrymander the electoral process, and then after an opposition party has been through the ringer of MI5 infiltration and subversion, lawfare, changing the rules so that foreign donations can't go into the party, despite multiple donor scandals in the sitting party. Multiple corruption scandals even. Louise Haigh has been behind the orchestration of Andy Burnham becoming Prime Minister, and she was kicked out of Starmer's cabinet as Transport Secretary because of fraud. The same with Angela Rayner. She failed to pay her council tax on time for her second home, she didn't declare it properly or whatever, and she's now on LBC as a guest host talking about Farage's donations, as if she has any legitimacy. Keir Starmer himself had all of those undeclared donations from Lord Ali. Pretty weird relationship going on there, but nevertheless I won't comment. But don't worry, we've got Mr. Blobby standing next to you, so we can all point and laugh at you for your earnest attempt to actually fix the country, while untold horrors are inflicted on us anyway. You know what? I don't think it's very funny. And I don't think many people will find it funny either. I think that things are so serious, events have progressed to such an extent that we just can't afford this absurdity anymore. And people will reject it. And that's a good thing. And I think, inadvertently, Farage will come out of this stronger. And these are equivalent to Trump's 2022-2023 years, where he was facing the FBI raiding Melania's underwear drawer, or he was facing frivolous lawsuits from E. Jean Carroll, and all of these charges from like Fannie Willis and whoever else, Alvin Bragg, and eventually he had his mugshot taken. And it leads right up until the assassination, when it becomes kinetic, and it becomes very real. And when suddenly people realise that the lawfare waged against him, the stochastic terrorism, to borrow a term, of the mainstream media constantly calling him Hitler and a threat to democracy and in the pay of Vladimir Putin, has painted a target on his back and has gotten a father, Corey Compatore, killed. And I think we're getting to that point. And anyone willing to play along with that frivolity will be to blame for it as well when things get serious. This is why Ron DeSantis made a grave mistake for his entire political career when he ran against Trump in 2023, and when asked in the campaign trail, what do you think of the Stormy Daniels case, he said, well, I don't know anything about paying hush money to a porn star, as if he was making light of, or treating legitimate, the dragging through the courts of Donald Trump just to try to prevent him from being president again. And all that did was marshal support for Trump against DeSantis, because DeSantis looked like he was being disloyal to Trump, who was the scion of the party at that point and remains it. And because DeSantis didn't have the political nous to see the inevitability of Trump's return, not just in the election, but also to the White House. And so that's why it would have been very imprudent for Restore Britain to have stood in the Clacton by-election, and it would be imprudent for them to stand again, because you look like you're playing the part of Ron DeSantis, a ankle-biter that is gleefully playing along with an establishment stitch-up because you stand to gain personally at the expense of not just Nigel Farage, but the hopes of the country that people are pinning on Farage. You look like you're participating in a show trial at the very same time the country is facing destruction. You look like you are not serious. And I think we've already had a harsh reminder of that, because while everyone was cackling about Count Binface, Anne Widdecombe got murdered. And Nigel Farage went down and laid a wreath at the site where he could remember his friend. And then there was a deluge of articles from The Times, tweets from opposition journalists, people going as far as to accuse him of a conspiracy of having her killed to distract from his donations scandal. He's mourning a friend that got killed because, it seems, of her affiliation with Reform, and because of her long-standing advocacy for patriotic, socially conservative Catholic politics. Because at first we were told, oh, don't speculate, it's got nothing to do with politics. And it could well have been, some random druggie who broke in, didn't realise who she was, robbing a pensioner and killed her in a struggle. And it would have been no less tragic and appalling if that were the case. But now it seems political. And so the political maelstrom swirling around Farage has become that bit more deadly. Now, even Shabana Mahmood has had to concede that they may need to revisit the proposals about his taxpayer-funded security, which was significantly diminished the day after Charlie Kirk was murdered. Now, his claim that he needs private, friendly donors, like George Cottrell and Christopher Harborne, to pay for his lifelong security, at least until he wins the next general election, then has lifelong taxpayer-funded security as a Prime Minister and ex-Prime Minister, seems a lot more credible now, doesn't it? Nevertheless, you've got people like Dan Hodges at the Mail. Dan Hodges, who was Gawain Towler of UKIP's, now on the Reform Board, though seems completely out of lockstep with the party. Dan Hodges, who was Gawain Towler's contact ahead of the 2015 election, so that UKIP could vet their candidates via Hope Not Hate. So Dan Hodges, Hope Not Hate operative, is now amplifying a Times article. The Times, again, who published photos of Nigel Farage's daughter's house, who have tasked a journalist who previously tweeted about how he hated Farage, the Times who endorsed Labour at the last election, who publish Tory apparatchiks like Fraser Nelson, who just willfully lie about the costs and crimes of migration they've supported. He quote retweeted a Times newspaper that said Nigel Farage has been accused of using Anne Widdecombe's death as propaganda, and that an unnamed family source with the Mail told the paper Widdecombe's family didn't want her death hijacked for political purposes and were very uneasy about Farage attending the scene of the investigation. It was also conspicuous the BBC reported that specially trained officers were working with Widdecombe's family. So, probably Raiku intervening to sort of coerce them to give a don't look back in anger statement again. But Anne Widdecombe's murder, even that, is not beyond the pale for Farage's opponents to use against him. And so all this is going to do is endear sympathy for the man. And again, this is coming from me, who has been consistently critical of Farage when he's put a foot wrong. Now, I've been praiseworthy where it's warranted. His statement after Henry Novak's murder, excellent. His Substack post on how Britain is an anti-white state, which we'll be mentioning in a forthcoming video, very well done. And so all that this will produce is that people who have criticised him in the past, recognising reality, which is that this is a stitch-up, this is ill-motivated at every level, and wanting him to win it, because obviously it would be a bad thing if Nigel Farage lost the Clacton by-election, which he won't, but it would be bad, because then it would reward all of these awful underhanded tactics by Parliament, by the media, by state-approved satirists, to mock and deride people who dare to talk about the very real problems that our country faces and dares to fix them as well. And it's not like they don't have a legitimate reason to want more security. It's not like Reform don't have a legitimate reason to be worried. Because I see the Mail reporting that Zia Yusuf is being unduly paranoid. Apparently, there are people in Reform that are like briefing to enemy press, like The Observer, or even potentially the Mail here, that they want Farage to take a proper holiday, and then some of them have told the Times and The Observer they want him to sack Zia Yusuf because they're worried that he's too paranoid and too polarising. They say they want Farage to crack down on rampant paranoia and infighting within Reform as the party's polly shrinks, as we started with. According to a source, Zia Yusuf is so fearful about being bugged that he started holding important meetings in the back of his car as it's been driven around. Yeah, I don't blame him for wanting to take his security seriously. Not just because, as Richard Tice has pointed out, the National Crime Agency may have leaked details about his finances and Nigel Farage's finances to The Guardian back in April. So apparently, George Cottrell's mum sent £500,000 to Richard Tice, and then another £500,000 to his think tank, Britain Means Business. And only one of these was declared. And also the details about the Harborne donation, or which was flagged as a suspicious transaction by the National Crime Agency, may have also been handed off to The Guardian by leakers in the National Crime Agency, which would of course be illegal, because those are meant to be confidential, they're meant to be a government department. And Tice is now, as he's told the Telegraph, raising a query with the National Crime Agency as to whether or not Reform has been the victim of malicious leaking by activists within the state to newspapers that would like to see Farage halted in his tracks. So I don't blame Zia Yusuf at all for taking extra precautions. I don't blame him for wanting to be on the move so that he can't be attacked if he's caught unawares by security. Like, it must be really difficult to just go and have dinner somewhere, for example. So, you know, I won't disclose too much. But in the course of my friendship with the former Prime Minister Liz Truss, unexpected friendship, whenever we've just gone for a catch-up, it's had to be screened ahead of time, there's had to be extensive security, scoping out the place, they've got to wait around there, and she faces fewer threats than Farage does, I'm sure, but those are still precautions that you have to go through. And those are sort of like state protocols, because she's an ex-Prime Minister. If you're having to do all this privately, there's even more additional logistics that you have to consider, because a venue might not want private security on their premises, unlike what they might have to accept from Scotland Yard or the state, for example. So there's all sorts of additional difficulties that must just make their lives cumbersome. And so, again, I'm sympathetic. But instead, there are people within Reform now seizing upon this. As Jacob Rees-Mogg alleged, it could be that the leaks about George Cottrell's donations came from within Reform itself. When asked whether the stories about Cottrell had come from inside the tent from within Reform, as part of leadership manoeuvring around Farage, he said that wouldn't be surprising, it's politics. So both Farage and Zia Yusuf, now in Question Time, are making the contours known to the public about people within Reform trying to bring Reform down from the inside. Like, the call is coming from inside the house. Farage and Zia are now making the call. A Reform source said, there's definitely a chatty rat in Reform. And that's the nickname given to the leaker of COVID-19 lockdown plans in 2020. Cottrell has the power to tell Nigel to block people from good jobs or being a by-election candidate, so there's every incentive to bring him down. And, again, without disclosing too much, I do know that Farage takes George's advice seriously, because he's described him as being like a son. And there was a set to over whether or not someone should be hired in, I think it was 2024 or early 2025. And George Cottrell and another high-profile member of Reform's leadership team, who I think now would regret the decision they've made, disagreed. And Cottrell's advice was overruled. But he certainly does weigh in on matters of prudence and judgment to Farage, because he's a confidant and friend. I think that's understandable. Someone said, it's an internal power struggle. The trouble is that George's reach is so extensive, it could bring Nigel down with him, and where's the party then? And it's almost like that's the goal. We've been documenting in previous videos the internal power struggle in reform between some Tory defectors, between people that have orchestrated those Tory defections, and someone like Zia Yusuf, who has seen himself as the heir apparent. And it says in here, when former Tory Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick defected to reform in January, it was said to have come as a blow to Richard Tice and Yusuf, who was understood to have regarded himself as the anointed successor. A source said, "This is it," he thought, "I'll be leader after Nigel." There was always tension with Richard after that. Then Jenrick came in, and both were knocked off course. But it was less of a blow to Richard than to Zia. There's someone very, very close leaking. A lot of the stuff about George I personally had no clue about. Extraordinary. I guess there's multiple sources. But there's clearly one source that's very close in. And it seems like the person talking to the Mail, acting as a senior source about the infighting, is trying to blame Zia for the leaking about George Cottrell. But Farage isn't blaming Zia. People around Farage aren't blaming Zia. If anything, Zia and lots of people that are trying to encourage Farage to change tactics are closing ranks. So this seems like even more manoeuvring by someone with a vested interest, not to just get rid of Farage and Cottrell, but Zia too, to open up a pathway to take over reform, perhaps to complete its conversion into a recycled Tory party, performing political necromancy on the Conservatives. The source added, Zia's gone a bit mental. If he wants to see you, he'll summon you down and drive around Westminster in the back of a van. That is why you see him doing his television appearances from there, rampant paranoia. Yusuf didn't respond to the request for comment, and Cottrell said he thought it was total bullshit that he was being briefed against from within the party. So again, the people that are closest to Farage are saying that they don't think it's Zia, they don't think it's James Orr, they don't think it's some of Farage's most loyal and top team, they think it's coming from the Tory defectors. We already saw previously how the likes of Tim Montgomery are just blatantly on the timeline calling for Zia to be deposed because he thinks that he's too hostile to the Tories. He's too off-putting to potential converts that have just realised that the 14 years of governance that they supported has been ruinous for our country. And to Zia's credit, he understands that. And Reform are actually starting to get it on multiple fronts. Because the fact that Farage hasn't thrown Zia under the bus, the fact that Farage has shown some resilience against these underhanded leaking tactics, and that the team have sort of sniffed out what's going on, has shown that, again, they're willing to listen to criticism. And I'm glad that some of my criticisms have been well received in recent weeks. And you can see that in here, in this long piece in The Spectator by Tim Shipman, evaluating the prudence of Farage's gambit, calling the by-election, and now being forced to stand against Binface. So, Reform have responded to every party withdrawing from the by-election. They say they're cowards because they know that Farage will win. But it opens with the following anecdote. And I spoke to a source in Reform who said that the meeting didn't go as is described here, but I will say that the theme of trying to listen to their critics and realising what's gone wrong after they've underperformed in by-elections, after they've subsided in the polls, after they've sustained a series of unanticipated attacks, the theme that Reform are listening to critics is true. So, the piece opens with, when Reform High Command gathered in the boardroom of their Millbank headquarters last Tuesday, the meeting was supposed to select candidates in their 120 most winnable seats and choose dozens of campaign managers. If you want a bit of feedback, ditch Layla Cunningham. She's a total liability, she gives terrible interviews, and people in the outer boroughs of London don't like her, and that's why you're currently in third behind the Tories in the London mayoral polling. Anyway, the meeting went on for 6 hours, as party chiefs instead addressed a growing sense of unease that the great momentum of 2025 had been lost. A source familiar with the discussions reveals that Chris Bruni-Lowe, pollster and message man, also a long stalwart employee of UKIP and the Brexit Party, who was alleged to be telling the party previously not to focus on immigration in 2024, which is one of the reasons why they might have backed off, and it's because the polling wasn't as good as the polling the likes of Banksy and Aaron Banks, and Andy Wigmore were conducting during the Brexit referendum, so that was a misstep. Anyway, Chris Bruni-Lowe apparently had been concerned for months that Reform needs to do something big to take back control. Chris challenged people, saying things aren't working the way they need to, said the source. James Orr, Robert Jenrick, and Zia Yusuf were all asked for their best ideas, but nothing much was forthcoming. It was at this point the source says that Farage said words to the effect of, "It's time to put my own testicles on the line." A Reform source says, since about February, there'd been a growing feeling that Reform was becoming a party which was no longer in command of its own destiny as we would wish to be. February is, of course, when Restore Britain launched. Restore is growing. Every innovation we made in political technology was nicked and adopted by the other parties. And that's true. When Farage tries to ride the wave rather than build it himself, he finds himself behind the curve, outpaced by events. And so, and I think this was why Farage called the by-election, they felt the need to summon some courage they didn't realise that they would need to deploy ahead of when they thought they would need to deploy it. And so this is why you're seeing a rush to catch up with rhetoric, to regain lost credibility. And even if the meeting didn't pan out exactly as was described by this source, who himself may have ulterior motives for leaking to the Spectator, for looking like the only credible voice in the room, while Reform's top leadership, particularly James Aurangzeb, who are quite closely aligned, apparently seem bumbling and clueless and don't know what's going on. Even though there might be some ill motive to this leak, it is generally true that Reform are doing some soul-searching. This is something that even Isabel Oakeshott admitted on air with Reform proxy and talk host Jeremy Kyle. Isabel Oakeshott being the fiancée of Richard Tice. She said that Reform are trying to understand why they've consistently underperformed despite being at the top of every opinion poll. And core to their diagnosis is the understanding that Restore didn't need to exist. That if you hadn't have booted Rupert Lowe out of the party and reported him to the police, no matter how difficult you may have found to work with him, if you hadn't have left lots of talent on the table, gone out of your way to estrange the online right, if you hadn't have misjudged the public mood on things like who is British, whether or not there is an ethnic component to English, Scottish, Welsh and Irish identity, whether or not people would like not just the mass deportation of illegals, but millions of legal migrants to return home too, whether or not just that Muslims are the least likely demographic to vote for you, but that the public despise Islam. Overwhelmingly, they think it is incompatible with our civilization, with our preferences, with our prejudices, with our identity. They've misjudged all of these things, and now they're trying to recover from it. Some people were warning them, me included, but US strategist Jerry Gunster, who has hosted various parties that Farage has been guest of honour at, including the party hosted for the 250th anniversary of America and the inauguration night party, which I attended January last year, he has identified Restore Britain as a danger. But one problem with their misdiagnosis is one Reform source says, or at least is trying to put out into the ether, that Restore is a Tory put-up job expertly organised by Gavin Williamson. That's not true. Gavin Williamson actually denies he is the Midlands answer to Machiavelli. Not true. Again, knowing the people that were involved in setting up Restore, the young lads, and having conversations at the time, that wasn't the case. It was set up as a pressure campaign to force Reform to be less shit. Now, it was possible that Reform could, in an act of contrition, the likes of which Donald Trump performed in 2023 and 2024, bringing all of his former adversaries into the fold, like RFK, JD Vance, Tulsi Gabbard, it was possible that a Reform whip could even be offered back to Rupert Lowe in an act of contrition and reconciliation that would have solved the problem. Because the Tories were certainly trying to court Rupert Lowe. They kept offering him the whip and he said no. That's why they offered him the seat on the Public Accounts Committee. They thought they would entice him in, and instead Lowe quite cleverly judo flipped the proposition and formed his own party. And actually, by forming a party, they have placed sufficient pressure on Reform that their goals as a pressure campaign are being achieved. Reform had to adopt mass deportations after Harrison Pitt published his deportations document. They've had to adjust their rhetoric on things like identity and anti-white racism after Restore have shown that there is a sizable constituency that is in favour of it. And they've had to recognise that they've lost thousands of canvassers, campaigners, and alternative media supporters. Because they thought that come 2029, all those people would have no option but to vote for them anyway. And they didn't even need to win their vote over. But to try to dismiss Restore as just a Tory Trojan horse would be a mistake. Because it's not an accusation that lands when the top brass of Restore, like Charlie Downs and Harrison Pitt, are banned for life from the Tory party. But also, it's equally as a Westminster bubble conversation as something like Farage's donations are. Like you're basically, the fact that you're leaking this line to the Spectator means it won't have cut through to the public, because it will stay in the Spectator. And as the Spectator say, with some hand-rubbing glee, I'm sure, the claim highlights the degree to which Lowe is living rent-free in Reform heads, and the degree to which they still see the Tories as an establishment conspiring against them. They're true about the latter, they're not true about their accusation, but Shipman is true about the former. That Rupert Lowe now exists as a kind of, like the entity from It Follows, or you know the gamble of would you take $1 million if there was a snail that followed you around for the rest of your life, and if it touched you once you die. Rupert Lowe is the snail that's going to follow Farage around forever now. And so the accusations of being just another Tory tactic to sabotage the chances of reform don't land when you've got a lot of top Tory defectors in your team, and it also doesn't land with the general public, who have to know the infighting in Westminster, the respective characters in this political WWE match, in order to understand the charge. Instead, all they'll see is someone like Lowe sounding more right-wing than Farage on Facebook, and think, well, okay, I may as well just vote Lowe instead, even if his prospects of gaining government are lower than reforms. And this will especially be true if reform continues to dip in the polls, and it looks like the value proposition of reform, being more likely to win government even though they're not as hardline as Restore are, is decreased. And some in reform do understand this. Shipman writes, "You wouldn't know it from much of what passes for political debate in this country, but two things can be true. Yes, many figures in the establishment are out to get Farage. Some are peddling text messages to media outlets about his private life. But it is also the case that even sage voices in reform think their leader would have been wiser to declare the $5 million gift, and believe his team have handled the fallout badly. A Farage ally who thinks he should have been more transparent explains, when you have been vilified as much as he is not inclined to give his enemies any advantage at all. This is a sensible opinion. Everything should have been above board. All the T's crossed, all the I's dotted, because even if they were going to go for you anyway, you have the additional narrative power to say, I did everything right and they tried to stop me anyway. Because, as Trump once said, they're not after me, they're after you, I'm just in the way. And some people understand that, which is why Farage and his team need to remain squeaky clean from now on, but also why they need to not just adjust their rhetoric, but admit that they got it wrong, that they misjudged public mood, that they felt that they had to say certain things because either it would have broken the Electoral Commission laws or because they thought the public weren't ready for it yet. And you basically need to rerun the Stephen Edgington interview in reverse and get it right this time. And it will be a humbling experience, but it will be the only way out of this blind alley that reform have walked themselves down. And so this final paragraph that I'm going to read ties together the sort of theme of this video. Has the refusal of the main parties to join the fight in Clacton scuppered Farage? I don't think so. There has always been a tension between Farage the insurgent and Farage the Prime Minister in waiting. The desire to seem as though he was taking preparations for government seriously peaked earlier this year with a series of defections by Tories with cabinet experience and plans by Danny Kruger to work out what reform would do in power. But this is not won over polite opinion or much of the Tory press. Tuesday's Gambit, last week's Gambit, suggests Farage wants to return to what he knows best, talking directly to his target voters through videos and social media. There was a time where Farage was complaining about the vile online abuse that Zia Yusuf had suffered, calling some of his own supporters racist, embracing Lib Dem, Green and Labour defectors, trying to court the positive opinion of Fraser Nelson of the Times. It has taken a long time to realise that these people were never going to like you. You were never going to be respected. You've always been their bogeyman, you always will be. And if you had their endorsement, then that would be an indictment for your political project. Because if they liked what you were doing, you wouldn't be serving your constituents. You wouldn't be saving the country. And so there has been a slow, sudden, but not too late realisation by reform that they need to listen to their base, listen to their critical friends, as it were. And so here are just some things that reform can do to reverse their fortune. Firstly, you're getting absolutely killed on socials because for all of your boasting about TikTok analytics, every time you say something dumb in an interview that counter-signals patriotism, let's say nationalism as a byword, or nativism, it gets turned into an Instagram edit and contrasted with Rupert Lowe saying millions must go, every Deliveroo cyclist is going to be packed on a plane and sent back to Afghanistan. So, like, the latter has rhetorical power and aura. And so, I'm not going to lie to you, Chief, you're getting killed in the Instagram edits. Okay, so your socials game sucks. Next, you're playing people out of position. Why is Robert Jenrick your shadow treasury spokesperson when he has basically zero business experience, except questionable donations from porn and property tycoons? The guy was very effective, actually, as Shadow Justice Minister, making those I'm walking on the street and telling you about how a man was convicted for burning a Quran in Britain videos. He was much better when he was working challenging Shabana Mahmood or David Lammy. And you can tell that's where he thrives because he's a lawyer. That's what he's trained for. So there's no shame in an early reshuffle, just swap Jenrick out with someone a bit more credible. Hell, you could even have a business outsider come in as your Treasury spokesperson. It's happened before. You just make him a lord and stick him in the cabinet. And that's what Keir Starmer did with, disastrously, Lord Hermer. Or David Cameron was made a lord and then cycled in as the foreign secretary under Rishi Sunak. So you can just do that. And speaking of swapping candidates out, look, Layla Cunningham is a terrible pick. She just causes you headaches. She runs her mouth, calls your own base neo-Nazis, cries about some AI edit of her asleep in Rupert Lowe's wheelbarrow. She's shrill. She doesn't know what she's talking about. She got caught on the hook by Julia Hartley-Brewer last week when Hartley-Brewer asked, why don't you have a defence spokesperson? What's your defence policy? And she gish-galloped and stuttered and said, well, I can't really list a policy off the top of my head. She's a total disaster. Trade her out. People don't want it. And also, look, your own base don't want to vote for a Muslim. So give that LARP up. And finally, you need to get a firm position on demographics. That is one of the most salient issues when people are polled for the British public. Like, Migration Watch recently did some polling. 45% of the British public, that's the single largest survey response of the 4 or 5 they gave, said, I don't want to become a minority in my own country. But we know that the children being born now, my children included, will be a minority in their own generation by 2031. Farage said it wasn't his concern to Stephen Edgington. Richard Tice said, who cares, it's a long way off, I'll be dead by then. That's not the attitude you need to have. It's not the attitude of a patrician, or a parent, or a grandfather, which many of you are. Like, one of the more touching things that Farage said is that his first grandchild was born when he was campaigning. Okay? If you care about your children and your grandchildren, you should care about them possessing their own country as an unquestionable demographic majority. The term demographic security is a sensible one that people don't get spooked by. It's utterly reasonable. It's what every other country expects. Japan, Israel, India, the like. So we should be afforded it too. In fact, Farage's horror after the 2021 census released that Birmingham, Leeds, Leicester, Luton, Bradford, Manchester and London were minority white British was the correct response. You should have stuck to it. And it's still possible to stick to that now. And you can actually pivot and say, you know, as we've seen with all of the anti-white racism, with the attacks on Henry Novak, with the attempted beheading in Belfast by a Sudanese migrant, with the anxieties around immigration, the national debate about who is English, I got it wrong. There is such a thing as the native British people, and they should obviously be a majority in their own country, just as we'd expect Jews to be a majority in Israel, the Japanese to be a majority in Japan. That's a perfectly reasonable answer that I know that a lot of Reform's leadership actually agree with, but unless you give it on camera, you will be haunted by the previous clips of your interviews forever, and people will not let it go, because fundamentally people don't trust you until you change your mind and change it credibly. Whether or not all these things will be listened to, I don't know. I'm just going to put them out there, because I've been surprised as to learn who actually watches my stuff. The reason I'm doing this is because I'm not taking any party's side. I'm taking my own side. These are the politics that are in the interest of me, my children, my nation, my loved ones. So whichever party makes a credible pitch to carry them out, I will be in favour of. To tie it all together, I think Farage wins the Clacton by-election. I think this will backfire on the establishment that thought standing Count Binface against him would be funny. And I think that the murder of Anne Widdecombe shows that we don't actually have time for this circus, because things are getting a lot more coarse, kinetic, violent than many of our politicians expected, and pretending they aren't won't make them go away.